In this video, I'm going to show you how to calculate confidence interval for population proportion. The data I'm using is the data we downloaded from New York Stock Exchange closing data at the end of a day in September of 2015. Symbols have been changed to comply with the copyright laws. Let's say that in this situation, I'm interested in knowing what proportion of the stocks had a positive change at the end of the day. So what we have recorded from the New York Stock Exchange is the value of the stock at the end of the day, what was the net change that it had, and whether it was a negative change or a positive change. So it has gone up if this percentage is positive, and it's gone down if this value is negative. If I'm interested in knowing the proportion of what has gone up or not, first I have to classify each stock as a positive value or a negative value. So how am I going to do that? So I'm going to answer a question like, has it gone up? And to do this, I'm going to use a logical function from Excel. So I'm going to say if this value that I see here is a positive value, so it's greater than 0, then return a value of 1. Otherwise, return a value of 0. So if I return this, and if I've done it correctly, the first stock that I have classifies as a 0 because it did not go up. So 0 means false. No, it didn't go up. And let me just copy this down until we get to a positive value. Here we have a stock that went up on that day. So if I've done this correctly, this should return a value of 1. And indeed it does. For everything else in between, because everything is negative, it returned a value of 0. Here, because the value that sits in the cell that I'm checking, D11, is greater than 0, it returns a 1, and I get to know that that's a stock that has gone up. So you can essentially copy this down all the way. So I put my crosshair here, double click, and it populates the entire thing. So again, we have all of the stocks at that day, which is over 2,100 stocks recorded here. So first, I'm going to find out how many went up. I'm going to say number that went up. And that number is simply sum of everything here. Remember, they get a 0 if they didn't go up. So if I add all the ones, I will find out what was total number that went up at the end of that day. So Control Shift down, close the parentheses, return, scroll up to see the number. So 383 stocks on that day went up. So if I want to know what is the proportion, I have to take this number and divide it by the total number of stocks that were reported back at the end of the day. So in order for me to know how many stocks are in this column, or basically in this column, I need to find the total number, which is count. Count is simply, I can ask Excel to count the number of values that it finds here. So if I put my cursor again here, Control Shift down, close the parentheses, return, I would see that on that day, I had 2,192 stocks that were reported in this data set. So what was the proportion of ups? It is simply 383 divided by 2192. So those two cells divided. So roughly about 17.5% of the stocks went up, the rest did not. So this is definitely going to be a rough day for the stock market. So now let's look at what happens if we do sample. So an idea behind sampling is that you have a sample. So let's say you have 127 stocks that you have in your 401k, or you have invested in, or whatever. So you basically hold a sample of the entire stock market. How did you fare? And can you estimate based on your data what was the number of ups and downs in the stock market as a whole? So we will repeat the same thing here. I want to know how many went up here in my stock, in my portfolio, and I'm going to repeat it the same way. If this value is a positive value, which is greater than 0, return a value of 1, otherwise return a value of 0, and I'm going to say return, put my crosshairs here, and repeat it. So the entire 127 stocks that I own also gets repeated as 0 and 1. So what is the proportion for my portfolio? So again, I'm going to find the sum of the ups, and that would be the sum of the values I have here. Then I'm going to look at the count. I should have 127 because that's what I have told you, but it never hurts to redo it. Count. And as I mentioned, I have 127. So now my proportion of up for my portfolio is simply 20 divided by 127. So in terms of ups and downs, there are only 15.75% that went up in mine. So can I come up with a confidence interval here? So if I assume a 95% confidence interval, then what I know is that my Z value is going to be, I know it's 1.96, but I'm just going to show it to you. Remember, I have to put 0.975 here, and I get a 1.96. This is my Z value. If you need a reminder of why I had to put that, is because if you look at the normal distribution, I'm saying that I'm going to create the 95th percentile. So 2.5% is here, 2.5% is here. So if you look at this Z value, everything to the left of it is that 0.95 that's in the middle, and this 0.025. So you're saying 0.975 would have a Z of 1.96. I'm trying to come up with my confidence interval. Remember, what is the confidence interval? Confidence interval is your p hat plus or minus Z of alpha over 2 times the standard error, which is your p minus 1p divided by n. This is my standard error. So I'm going to calculate my standard error here. And my standard error is square root of, and I'm going to use as many parentheses as I need to make sure that my order of operation is correct. So it's p hat times 1 minus the p hat. And this is going to give me the numerator under that square root divided by my sample size. And in this case is my count, 127. Now I'm ready to close my parentheses and return. So now I can calculate my margin of error. And my margin of error is simply your Z value times your standard error. So now I can highlight the values that I'm going to use. One would be margin of error, and the other one would be my sample proportion. So focus on what I have highlighted. So now my 95% confidence interval would be the lower part of it, and the upper part of it is going to be the sample proportion, which is right here, minus the margin of error. And the upper would be sample proportion plus the margin of error. If I'm going to use my portfolio as a sample, then based on what I have experienced in my portfolio, I suspect that about 9.4% to 22% is what the stock market has experienced in terms of proportion of stocks that went up on that day. And of course, in my case, my sample would have given me the right answer. Why? Because looking back on that day, I see the true proportion was 17.5%, and clearly this interval would capture 17.5%. This is how we can use sample proportion to create a confidence interval, an estimate for what the population proportion might have been.